Hello everybody, hello Clavichord France. This is Jermaine Sprosse from Basel, Switzerland, and I'm very happy to be your guest for these Clavichord days that unfortunately cannot happen live but will happen online. So I am happy to present a little video to you on a composer that is very dear to me. His name is Ernst Wilhelm Wolf, and he lived from 1735 to 1792. Ernst Wilhelm Wolf is being said was already a very accomplished keyboard player and continuist by the age of 10, and a little later got into contact with the music of CPE Bach. And afterwards CPE Bach became a strong influence on Wolf's music and actually on his entire aesthetic of music writing, and especially writing for the clavichord. And Wolf and CPE Bach became associates and stayed in a contact of friendship, most probably until the end of CPE Bach's life. In the 1760s, Wolf settled in Weimar at the court, where he became Kapellmeister, so master of the court chapel, in 1772. And he stayed in a friendship-like contact with CPE Bach during his lifetime. As I said, CPE Bach's music was a strong influence on Wolf, and I think that was especially the case late, to be exactly in the 1780s, when CPE Bach composed his 6 Sammlungen für Kenner und Liebhaber, for which Wolf apparently also helped to find subscribers. But the influence on Wolf must have been strong, especially in terms of the quality and the kind of the music, because it led Wolf to compose something similar. He composed in 1784 a remarkable set of pieces that he calls One Sonatine for affektvolle Sonaten, affectful sonatas, and a huge piece that in this kind I haven't seen before. It's beginning with a free fantasy, similar to CPE Bach, but also very unique in style. Then there's a huge set of variations on an andante theme, most likely written by Wolf himself, and it ends again with a free fantasy, a remarkable piece of music. So as in CPE Bach, where there are usually 6 pieces in each of the Sammlungen, there are also these 6 pieces in Wolf's set. But what is even more remarkable than this is a foreword, a kind of treatise, how to play the clavichord and also how to understand Wolf's music, that he puts in the beginning of the set. And this foreword, this treatise, is something I would like to speak about today, and of course also show musical examples of Wolf's keyboard music to you. We have more than 60 sonatas that survived, which is quite a great number. And these date from very early, so about 1760, until the end of Wolf's life, which would be 1792. What I find worth a remark at this point are the titles of the sonatas, or the titles of the different books of sonatas, so to say. The first set of printed sonatas are 6 keyboard sonatas printed in 1774. And here Wolf, or the publisher Breitkopf, so to say, still uses Italian as the main language and the harpsichord as the instrument to address to. So they are called 6 sonate per il clavicembalo. That seems remarkable in that sense that the keyboard music, when you look at it, is full of dynamic changes of articulation, of texture, of language. There's a lot of passion inside, a lot of, I would even say, a very personal sense of drama in the music, which of course is doable on the harpsichord, but the music here I'm maybe a little bit subjective, but the music is very clearly for the clavichord or some other dynamic and expressive keyboard instrument like an early fortepiano or whatever. But by 1774, one maybe still wanted to address to people who owned harpsichords, and the harpsichord was clearly still in use, so that explains it. However, just a year later, in 1775, Wolf publishes another set of 6 sonatas, which then is no longer written in Italian, but in German, saying 6 Sonaten für das Klavier oder Pianoforte. So it's interesting that only a year later, the clavier, which was mostly the clavichord, and the fortepiano were the main instruments, and so they already appear in the title. I find that worth a remark. The rest of the sonatas during Wolf's life all were for the clavier, and sometimes even including the fortepiano. So the harpsichord never appeared again in any of the titles. That being said, all the keyboard music by Wolf works fantastic on the clavichord, but there's one specific sonata movement that makes me doubt if not here some kind of fortepiano was what Wolf actually had in mind. And that would also be kind of logical, because in his treatise that I'm talking about, the Vorbericht from 1784, he at one point mentions the fortepianos by Heinrich Silbermann from Strasbourg as being really good alternatives to the clavichord. So it could be that for this sonata particularly, this was a kind of instrument that he had in mind, with the option of manually releasing the dampers. The clavichord, of course, cannot do that. Nevertheless, I would like to show this example to you because I find it very interesting. It is the third movement of a sonata in C minor from 1779. And for the first, let us say, 20 or 25 bars, it's typical Wolf clavichord texture with very short notes, with slurred sixth, with very beautiful two-voice arrangement. But then after a while comes what I'm going to show to you now. I start a little bit before it actually appears with these broken chords. And then there's this long quasi-fantasia-like arpeggio with a long bow under it that actually, for me, means let everything sound, let everything lie within the chord. The problem is just we have here written by Wolf 12 tones, so 12 notes, but I only have 10 fingers. So maybe you guys can realize that convincingly, but I have a bit of difficulty. And I think if I could just activate manually releasing the dampers, then this could just be some spreaded slow arpeggio with a fantastic effect that here I have to try to do just with the fingers. Let's see, maybe I can even do it better now. Now let's dive a little bit into Wolf's foreword, the treatise. I will limit myself to certain topics, and I hope that's okay with you because the time otherwise will get too extended. I want to mention a couple of things that Wolf writes in the beginning of this treatise. He remarks that he feels an urge of writing this because that hasn't been the case for a long time. And actually that makes sense, because when we think about it, CPE Bach's essay has been published 3 decades before, in 1753. And another important Klavierschule, the one by Georg Simon Löhlein,
was published two decades ago, so in the 1760s. So it is kind of understandable that Wolf felt an urge to say something on the matter, and also maybe he just wanted people to understand what clavichord playing meant to him and how his music and his general thinking of keyboard music should be understood. So at least I'm very happy that this treatise exists. Some of the requirements to the musician that Wolf mentions are the knowledge of thorough bass. I find that interesting. The knowledge of a good melody and the capacity to quasi-live the effects, so to transfer, to put yourself into the emotions and characters of the pieces. And with that he goes very much along what CPE Bach says, and also what then a little bit later Türk in his Klavierschule demands of the player. And he says that these things are really necessary to understand and feel and thus to perform pieces accordingly. After that there is a longer section where Wolf talks about inner and outer accents in the music. I will not get too much into this because I don't think it is that extremely relevant to us as clavichord players. However, I think what is really relevant are the technical advices by Wolf, and there's a first one I find worth a mention. It is when Wolf talks about syncopations on the clavichord. So a syncopation would be a thing like this. I will play it once normally for you. So this piece in a syncopated way would be for example. And here Wolf tells us that we have to strike the key with force and with a tight or stiff finger, in German straff, great word, and that we shall keep the fingers down according to the length of the note at an equal strength and pull the finger off the key just before playing the following note, so it gets really dense. I'm trying to do this now. While when I would play in a normal way, it's a lot less accentuated and a lot less full and rich in sound. So I think this is really good advice. Wolf also says that the syncopations, as well as various degrees of dynamic, must be practiced in both hands equally. So actually then I would have to do this exercise also on the left hand. And so on. So that was important to him. Later he talks about ornaments, Manieren, like trills, turns, Vorschläge, suspensions, etc., which mostly are equal to what CPE Bach and Türk says. So I won't get into that now. Wolf explains that in order to obtain a maximum of shading and expressivity in the playing, certain technical aspects must be realized. He mentions das Abstoßen, the detached, so the jeu détaché in French, versus das Schleifen oder Aneinanderziehen, which is a slurred way of playing. Furthermore, there's the appoggiato, which I'm going to show later, as well as the Bebung, the tremolo, which is the most essential for us as clavichord players, and the tempo rubato, which I will also explain and show later. Later on, he still adds the arpeggio, which in his music we find in single chords of sonata movements, but more extendedly in the free fantasy. So now let me get into a very interesting passage in Wolf's foreword. And that is when he speaks about the brillante Spielart, so the brilliant way of playing, which apparently, as he says, has been a very fashionable style of keyboard playing in his time. And the most examples I've found of this are in his own keyboard music, by the way. So some other examples can be found in Gruner's and in Rust's keyboard sonatas, but it's mostly Wolf himself who applies this. And before showing some examples of this, I would like to explain some technical advices by Wolf, which I find very interesting. So in general, what we're talking about here are notes, sequences of notes that are all played quasi détaché with dashes, as you will see later. And this is mostly, as Wolf says, happening in fast movements. So we're here talking about a way of playing that is very virtuosic and quite demanding, and apparently something very, very typical in clavichord playing and clavichord aesthetic of that period, at least for Wolf himself. And Wolf gives some concrete technical advice, and that is how we shall play these dashes, these accentuated short notes. The main technique here is abstoßen, as he says, and he explains how this needs to be done, saying that, as in the syncopations, we shall mainly play with a stiff finger, straffer Finger in German, so something like this. And we shall see that we pull the fingers towards us. So the finger towards the player. So not a normal release, but really something like which reminds me of CPE Bach and the Schnellen technique. And he gives some other really beautiful explanation. He says that we shall look for certain consonants when playing this. And the consonants ideally for this, as he says, are T and T. So I was wondering what that actually means. And the closest analogy for me is that the T is when the note starts or is being struck. The N is the actual sound of the tone, and the other T is when the key is being released. So maybe something like this. In a very extreme way. And now imagine, and now that leads to the example, how demanding it is to actually do this with broken chords in a fast tempo and in a kind of distant key like C minor. So I'm going to show a little bit of this to you, okay? Sonata C minor, third movement, 1779, we find things like this. So without the dashes, we would try to show the chords, of course, yeah? But with the dashes, we are kind of held back in the tempo and are forced, also with the fortissimo, to play super clearly and very strong. I try it again, it's really not easy. And so on. And Wolf also demands this in the left hand as an equally demanding solo. I show it here. And it's quite a task to do this in a way that the arm doesn't get too stiff, stays somehow relaxed, and the music still stays strong and clear and understandable. And here, if I even add the right hand, we get this. So something really intense and expressive and strong.